It usually begins with a quiet moment at the end of a long workday. The kind of moment where you finally close your laptop, lean back in your chair, and realize how much energy you've spent trying to do everything right. You answered every message quickly. You finished the tasks others avoided. You stayed a little later than everyone else, just to make sure nothing slipped through the cracks. From the outside, it looks responsible, the kind of work ethic most people admire. And for a long time, many of us believe that effort like this is the path forward. That if we simply become the most reliable person in the room, the most productive, the most committed, something good will eventually come from it. A better position, more security, maybe even a sense that all the extra effort was worth it. But over time, something subtle begins to happen. You start noticing that the people working the hardest aren't always the ones moving forward the fastest. Sometimes they're the ones carrying the most weight. The person who solves every problem slowly becomes the person everyone brings their problems to. The person who never says no quietly becomes responsible for things that were never part of the original job. And the strange part is that the smarter you are, the more capable you become, the easier it is for this pattern to form around you. At first it feels like recognition. Later it starts to feel like expectation. Eventually, for some people, it becomes something else entirely. A quiet realization that being the best employee in the room doesn't always create the kind of freedom they once imagined. In fact, for many thoughtful people, there comes a moment when the goal itself begins to feel slightly misplaced. Not because hard work stops mattering, but because they start to notice something about the system surrounding that work. Something that isn't obvious at first. And once that pattern becomes visible, it quietly changes the way they think about effort, value, and what it really means to move forward in their careers. When people talk about career success, the conversation usually sounds very simple. Work hard, be reliable, become the person everyone depends on. On the surface, this seems perfectly logical. Organizations reward people who contribute the most value. So the natural conclusion is that the most capable employee will eventually rise. But real workplaces don't always behave like a ladder. Sometimes they behave more like a system of balance. Imagine a bridge supported by several pillars. Each pillar carries part of the weight. Now imagine that one pillar becomes stronger than the others. Not just slightly stronger, but noticeably more reliable. At first, that strength looks impressive. But over time, more weight begins to shift toward it. Not intentionally, just gradually. More responsibility, more expectations, more problems that somehow land in the same place. The pillar didn't ask for the extra weight. It simply proved that it could carry it. Workplaces often function in a similar way. When someone becomes known as the most dependable person in the room, the system quietly adjusts around that reliability. Tasks flow toward competence. Decisions lean on the person who rarely fails. From a psychological perspective, this makes sense. Human beings naturally direct pressure toward the point where resistance is lowest. If one employee consistently solves problems faster, communicates more clearly, and finishes tasks more carefully, others begin to rely on that pattern without even noticing it. And slowly the role changes. Not officially, not on paper, but in the everyday rhythm of work. Instead of being the person who advances the fastest, the most capable employee sometimes becomes the stabilizer of the system itself. The person who keeps everything functioning, which sounds valuable, and in many ways it is. But stabilizers are rarely the parts that move. They are the parts that stay in place so the rest of the structure can keep running smoothly. And this is where a quiet misunderstanding begins to appear. Many people believe that being the best employee naturally creates upward momentum. But in certain environments, being the most dependable person doesn't push you forward. It anchors you exactly where the system needs you most. I remember a period in my own work life when this idea started to feel less theoretical. At the time, I had quietly built a reputation for being dependable. If something complicated appeared, it usually found its way to my desk. If a deadline looked uncertain, someone would ask if I could take a look at it. None of this happened suddenly. It grew slowly, the way habits grow inside a workplace. At first I took it as a compliment. It meant people trusted my judgment. It meant I was seen as capable. And like many people, I assumed that proving my value in this way would naturally lead somewhere better. So I kept leaning into that role. If a project needed extra attention, I stayed a little longer. If something felt unfinished, I tightened it up. If someone asked for help, I rarely said no. From the outside, nothing about this felt unusual. It simply looked like someone trying to do their job well. But after a while, I began noticing something small that felt difficult to explain. The more reliable I became, the less space I seemed to have. My days filled faster. My attention was constantly divided. And the strange part was that the things I was doing well didn't always seem to move my position forward. They just kept the system running. I remember sitting at my desk one afternoon, looking at a long list of tasks that had gradually become my responsibility, not because anyone officially assigned them to me, but because at some point I had been the person who fixed them. And a quiet question appeared in my mind. If being the most dependable person in the room mostly meant holding everything together, when exactly was the moment that allowed someone to step beyond that role? It wasn't frustration that I felt in that moment, more like a subtle confusion. I had followed the logic that most people believe in. Work carefully, be helpful, take responsibility, prove that you can handle more than others. Yet the result didn't feel like momentum. It felt more like I had become part of the structure that kept everything stable. And once that thought appeared, I started noticing the same pattern in people around me. Some of the smartest, most capable co-workers weren't trying to be the best employee anymore. Not because they had stopped caring about their work, but because they had begun to understand something about the role they were being asked to play. After noticing this pattern for a while, my relationship with work began to shift in a way that was difficult to describe at first. Nothing dramatic changed on the surface. I still showed up. I still did the work carefully. I still wanted to contribute something meaningful. But internally, the focus was no longer the same. For a long time, I had treated work almost like a test, a quiet competition to prove that I could handle more than others, solve problems faster, be the person everyone relied on. And slowly, that mindset started to feel less important. Not because competence stopped mattering, but because I began to see how easily competence can turn into permanent responsibility if it's not paired with something else. Something like awareness. Awareness of where your energy is going. Awareness of what role you are quietly stepping into every time you solve another problem. Once that awareness appears, the pace of work can feel a little different. The pressure to capture every task begins to soften. The urge to prove something with every opportunity slowly becomes less urgent. Some of the most thoughtful people I've met in professional environments seem to carry this quiet shift inside them. They still care about doing good work, but they no longer treat work as the sole measure of their value. There is a subtle difference in how they move through their responsibilities. Less tension behind every decision, less urgency to demonstrate that they are indispensable. In a way, they appear calmer, not because their work is easier, but because their sense of stability is no longer tied entirely to the role they play inside the organization. Their identity isn't built around being the strongest pillar holding everything up. Instead, there's a little more space between who they are and what they do each day. And interestingly, that space often changes how they think about progress. Advancement stops looking like a reward for carrying the most weight. It begins to look more like the freedom to choose where your effort actually goes. And when you begin to see work through that lens, something subtle starts to change in the way the whole idea of being the best employee feels. It no longer carries the same weight it once did. Not because excellence becomes unimportant, but because the meaning of excellence quietly shifts. For many people, especially thoughtful and capable ones, the early part of a career is shaped by a simple belief. If you contribute more, if you solve more problems, if you become the most reliable person in the room, then eventually the system will recognize that effort in a meaningful way. Sometimes it does, but sometimes the system simply learns to depend on that reliability. And over time, the most capable people begin to notice this pattern for what it is. Not a failure, not even a mistake, just a structure that rewards stability in a very particular way. The people who keep everything running smoothly often become the ones the system least wants to move, and once that realization settles in, the goal quietly changes. Instead of trying to be the person who carries the most weight, some people begin to care more about where that weight is coming from in the first place. They still do their work well. They still show up with care and thoughtfulness. But they no longer measure their progress by how indispensable they appear inside one structure. There's a quiet freedom in that shift, because when your sense of stability isn't built entirely around proving your value to a system, the pressure surrounding every task becomes lighter. Work becomes something you participate in, rather than something that defines the limits of your future. And for many people, that small change in perspective is where a different relationship with work slowly begins.